You are in the summary view of the Workstation 7.0 application. You can open the new virtual machine wizard by either using the File menu or the new virtual machine icon on the Workstation homepage. In this guided tour, let's use the new virtual machine icon to open the wizard. Now open the wizard by clicking the Create a New Virtual Machine icon. As with many installation wizards, the Create New Virtual Machine wizard prompts you to choose between a typical or custom configuration. Typical shortens the process by skipping some choices that rarely need changing from their defaults. The custom path provides more flexibility and options. To give you an opportunity to see all of the wizard options, select a custom configuration and click Next. Choose Virtual Machine Compatibility page appears. You have the option of selecting the version of Workstation with which the virtual machine should be compatible. The hardware features vary based on the version of Workstation selected. When you make a selection from the hardware compatibility list, you see a list of other VMware products and versions that are compatible with your selection. You also see a list of features that are not available for that version. In this guided tour, leave the default selection and click Next. The Guest Operating System page appears. You can select the source of the installation. In this guided tour, select the option I will install the operating system later and click Next. Select a Guest Operating System page appears. It gives you the option to select the guest operating system and version you plan to install in the guest. The wizard uses this information to select appropriate default values, such as adjust the amount of memory needed, naming files associated with the virtual machine, adjusting settings for optimal performance, and working around special behaviors and bugs within a guest operating system. If the operating system you plan to use is not listed, select Other for both Guest Operating System and version. You will be installing Windows XP Professional Edition in this virtual machine, so accept the defaults and click Next. Now you can enter a name for the virtual machine. The name you enter in the Virtual Machine Name field is the name that shows in the Workstation Console tab. It is also used as the name of the virtual machine's files. The name should be unique and may contain alphanumeric characters and the underscore and hyphen characters. In this practice session, enter the name as displayed in the information text box. You can also specify the location where you want to save the virtual machine files. In this guided tour, use the default location and click Next. The Processor Configuration page appears. On this page, you can select the number of virtual processors and cores per processor in the virtual machine. Keep in mind that choosing more than one virtual processor is not a standard configuration. Before configuring multiple virtual processors, consider that a virtual machine cannot have more CPUs than the number of logical CPUs on the host. Specifically, it cannot have more CPUs than the number of physical processor cores if hyperthreading is disabled, or 2 times the number of physical processor cores if hyperthreading is enabled. Your PC will have 2 logical processors if it has a single processor with hyperthreading enabled, a single processor with a dual-core CPU, a multiprocessor with 2 CPUs, regardless of whether they are dual-core or have hyperthreading enabled. Note that when you create a Workstation 4 virtual machine, this page will not appear. In this guided tour, leave the default values for the processor and cores per processor and click Next to continue. The memory page allows you to configure the virtual machine's memory size by selecting the number of megabytes. Recommendations are based on the guest operating system you choose on the previous page. The colored triangles along the slider represent the recommended amounts as indicated by the key on the wizard. You can drag the slider or select the number using the up and down arrows. Maximums for best performance represent the thresholds above which the host's physical memory is insufficient to run the virtual machine at full speed. Memory sizes that are larger than this value require a virtual machine's memory to be swapped in, substantially reducing the performance of the virtual machine. This value fluctuates as conditions on the host change, for example, as virtual machines are powered on or off. Regardless of the guest operating system, the minimum memory size is 4 megabytes. Note that the memory size must be a multiple of 4 megabytes. Although this wizard provides a default memory size for the virtual machine at time of creation, it's important that you understand the memory needs of your application and guest operating system so that you can set the memory size appropriately from the Virtual Machine Settings editor. Now accept the recommended memory for your virtual machine and click Next to continue. The Network Type page appears. Here you can choose the type of network that you want your virtual machine to use. For this guided tour, select the option Use Network Address Translation and click Next. The Select I/O Adapters Type page appears. The SCSI Controller Type page enables you to select one of the following types of SCSI controllers: Bus Logic Parallel, LSI Logic Parallel, LSI Logic SAS. The choice of SCSI controller does not affect whether your virtual disk is an IDE or SCSI disk. Use the default Bus Logic SCSI controller and click Next. A virtual disk comprises one or more files on the file system that appear as a single hard disk to the guest operating system. These disks are portable among hosts. When you perform a typical configuration, the wizard creates a new virtual disk for the virtual machine. For custom configurations, you can store a virtual machine's data in a new virtual disk, an existing virtual disk, or a physical disk. Virtual disks are the best choice for most virtual machines. They are quick and easy to set up and can be easily moved to different locations. For your virtual machine, you want to create a new virtual disk, so accept the default and click Next to continue. The Select Disk Type page appears. Accept the default recommended option IDE and click Next. Since you chose to create a new virtual disk, the Specified Disk Capacity page appears so you can select the size of the virtual disk. You can configure a disk from as small as 0.1 gigabytes to as large as 950 gigabytes for a virtual disk. The virtual disk should be large enough to hold the guest operating system and all the applications that you intend to install, with room for data and growth. For example, you need about 2 gigabytes of actual free space on the file system containing the virtual disk to install Windows XP and applications such as Microsoft Office inside the virtual machine. You cannot change the virtual disk's maximum capacity later, but you can install additional virtual disks later by using the Virtual Machine Properties dialog box. Select the option Split Virtual Disks into 2 gig files if your virtual disk is stored on a file system that does not support files larger than 2 gigabytes. For custom configurations, you are also given the option Allocate All Disk Space Now. VMware recommends that you allow the disk to grow. Allocating all disk space now gives somewhat better performance, but it is time-consuming. It also requires as much physical disk space as you specify for the virtual disk. For this guided tour, let's create a virtual disk with 4 gigabytes of disk space. Now click the down arrow in the Maximum Disk Size field until you reach 4 gigabytes and click Next to continue. Leave the option Store Virtual Disks as a single file unchanged and click Next. The Specified Disk File screen appears. You can store the virtual disks on the same location as the virtual machine or in another location. In this guided tour, leave the default location and click Next. The Ready to Create Virtual Machine page appears. The Ready to Create New Virtual Machine page gives you an opportunity to review your selections before creating the new virtual machine. You also have the option to edit additional settings before creating the virtual machine. This option opens the Virtual Machine Settings editor, which we will discuss later in the course. Review the options for the new virtual machine and click Finish to create the virtual machine. Well done! As soon as the virtual machine is created, you will be prompted to download the latest version of VMware tools for the selected guest operating system. You can either download it now or later. In this guided tour, let's cancel the download. The sidebar pane lists the virtual machine you created under the Favorites section. You can also see the virtual machine details in the console view. This concludes the Creating a New Virtual Machine guided tour. However, before you can use the new virtual machine, you must partition and format the virtual disk and install a guest operating system. You should also install VMware tools. We will discuss the installation of a guest operating system and VMware tools later in this module.